In the final push before tomorrow's midterms, President Trump will hold 3 rallies today. One of his biggest talking points has been immigration and the caravan of migrants making its way toward the U.S. The closest members of the caravan are still nearly 700 miles away from the U.S. border and are not expected to arrive for weeks.
An article in the Washington Post says it's estimated only 20% of the caravan will reach the border. And if that's true, the migrants would be outnumbered by soldiers at the U.S. border 5-1. Nick Miroff is a reporter at the Washington Post covering national security, enforcement and drug trafficking and joins us now to talk about this because, Nick, you've written articles essentially breaking down the numbers, the stats and the intelligence on what we know about the U.S. military presence and what's happening. Just break down for us what we know about the U.S. stance at the border and the intelligence of who's really coming toward the U.S.
Well, the numbers you were referencing come from an Army assessment of what troops at the border were likely to face and projections as to the final number of folks in the caravan who are likely to arrive. And their determination was that about 20% of those traveling north toward the border would actually make it. So if we work that out to about 1,500, 2,000 people, then those migrants would be vastly, outnumbered by U.S. soldiers and National Guard troops who are going to be deploying along the border.
So this planning document that you guys looked at sort of takes a look at all the possibilities, what could happen with this caravan, and sort of the worst case scenario was that it actually becomes more dangerous as it moves towards the border and is infiltrated by ne'er-do-wells and criminals. And then there's this other likely scenario of it being whittled down. At the end of the day, though, what are troops expected to do based on this data? We know that they cannot, by law, become a law enforcement force, if you will. So what are they supposed to be doing at the border?
Well, the troops are supposed to be there in a supporting role. They're going to provide aviation support. There are going to be construction brigades. We saw troops out there in the Rio Grande Valley over the weekend hanging concertina wire. There will be military police officers as well as medical teams. But I think it remains to be seen how many of these troops will actually be, right there with U.S. Border Patrol agents. The president has really gone out of his way to emphasize that these troops are supposed to project power and a forceful response, and we know they will be armed. So I don't think it's reasonable to expect that they'll just be standing in the background and just melting away.
So, Nick, we've heard a lot from the president about what he says these caravans are made up of. We've heard about unknown Middle Eastern people. We've heard about criminals. It certainly appears in the planning document that you look like that some of that is what the military has at least considered could be a possibility. Where do you think, when you hear the president talk, where do you think he's getting these little nuggets from?
So in the planning documents that we saw that were originally obtained by Newsweek and posted online, the military assesses that there are some Bangladeshis, Haitians, and African nationals mixed in with the caravan. If you talk to DHS, they insist that even though the president hasn't and the government haven't provided any evidence for his claim that there are quote-unquote Middle Easterners in the caravan, that it's a reasonable assumption to make because they get foreign nationals from about 100 countries coming through Mexico to the border each year. But I think, the important thing here is that the overwhelming majority of the migrants in the caravan are from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. And so they're coming up with their families, and we know they're not coming here for, reasons of terrorism. The Homeland Security Department says they know there are 270 criminals in with that group. So again, that's some degree of, some contingent of criminals perhaps, but a small portion overall among, the total group of more than 7,000.
And that is what is so interesting about this debate. There's been such political rhetoric focused on the small sliver of potential criminals and violence, when the vast majority of these individuals, mothers, children, fleeing violence. And also what stood out to me from one of your reports was the possibly hundreds of armed Americans, these Texas Minutemen, who are also on their way to the U.S. border to back up U.S. troops. What do we know about them and how the U.S. military is viewing them?
Well, the president has characterized the caravans as an invasion of the United States, and I think that has really inspired some of these armed border groups to want to head down there and play some kind of role in in backing up the military or the Border Patrol. Now, what we know from the military assessment is that is considered a potential risk for soldiers. They specifically mention in these planning documents the threat of unregulated militia groups. They project a couple hundred of these armed militiamen may be operating in areas where the troops are, and of course they're just anxious about anybody being in the same area they are, with high-powered weapons. So I spoke to a couple leaders of some of these groups, and they are in fact planning to head down to the border starting this week.
You said you spoke to a couple of leaders. I don't know if you spoke to them before or after the president did his press conference, where he said, rocks should be considered as rifles. He didn't say shoot people, but it was an interesting way of phrasing that. And when I read about these militia men that you were talking about, I thought, geez, are they going to interpret what the president says as a leeway or an opportunity to use their rifles? I'm wondering if, they mentioned anything, what it would take for them to engage members of this caravan, and whether or not, now wait, I should clarify, members of the caravan are going to checkpoints, official checkpoints. They're not sort of climbing over the border, but keeping that in mind, and whether or not the military is concerned that they would inflame a situation that could already be a little bit tense.
I think that's certainly a risk. We don't know that the caravan members will go to the U.S. ports of entry. And if at the U.S. ports of entry they find really severe limitations on their ability to come up to the port of entry and apply for asylum, then it's possible that large numbers of people will attempt to go down to the Rio Grande, for example, and come across illegally in order to be taken into custody and start the asylum process that way. And I think that's where you do get the possibility of some kind of volatile situation if soldiers and Border Patrol and armed militia men are all in this area and large numbers of people are gathered on the riverbanks. We could see potentially a combustible situation there, and that is what Homeland Security agents and the U.S. military are worried about.
Interesting stuff, and we appreciate your work on this. Nick Miroff, thank you.
My pleasure.